Rolling! It's something we all do. Even if you're at the top of the game or fresh off of a glory, rolling is always there. Throughout Smash history, it's been a primary defensive option. While often frustrating to new players, I've always found it to be a very balanced option. A good player can easily catch uncareful rolling, but a well-placed roll can still throw even the best player for a loop. But who really has the best roll? To most people, all rolls probably look almost the same. But when you actually start looking into it, you'll notice that most rolls are actually quite unique. So why don't we just get right into it? Who really has the best roll in Smash 4? So before we begin, let me explain exactly the way this is going to be going down. When grading a roll, I'll be looking at three different factors. First, the frame data. This comes down to how much intangibility the roll has, as well as how fast you can act after rolling. Usually there's not that big of a discrepancy in this case, as most rolls have very similar amounts of intangibility. Though there are some notable cases where this is not true. Second is roll length. Pretty easy to understand. How far does a roll travel? Having good length on a roll is very useful in some situations, while some other situations might benefit from having a shorter one. But generally having a longer roll is better. I use these squares on Windy Hill Zone to grade the length, with one square equaling 1 unit. Shouldn't be too complicated to understand. Third and finally, there is hurtbox shifting, and this is the point I very rarely see brought up when talking about rolls. If you are unfamiliar with hurtbox shifting, basically all characters in Smash 4 consist of a hurtbox that is connected to their character's body. When an opposing hitbox connects with your hurtbox, you get hit. And hurtbox shifting is when you use a move that extends or shifts your hurtbox in a direction, which often leads to you getting hit from ranges you otherwise would not. As you will see, this is actually a very big factor in what makes a roll good or bad. It's also important to consider how optimally a roll uses its intangibility frames. Having a long roll is only really great if there are intangibility to help you get through the entire way. It's also worth noting that there are two different versions of every roll in Smash 4, one forward roll and one back roll. I'll only be making note of the back roll when I feel there is something significant about them, so just keep that in mind. When testing, I'm using a bumper on the ground, since it has constant active frames and is a pretty huge hitbox overall. This is meant to emulate lingering hitboxes or jabs or other moves like that. I'll be rating the rolls with a grade from 1 to 3, with 1 being outright bad rolls, 2s being decent to good rolls, and 3 being rolls that stand out as great. Though do keep in mind that this is just my assessment, so don't just take the score at face value alone. I won't be mentioning the length of the roll every time unless it's very significant or I have something special to say about it, since they all land around the same distance. But I do take it into consideration for ranking the rolls. Though for reference, here are all the different roll distances for each character. Oh, and before we begin, I want to cover a few things. For most of my testing during this, Z-axis only came up extremely rarely, and therefore was not really a factor I wanted to take into consideration. If you are unfamiliar with the Z-axis in Smash 4, then that's not really a huge deal, since I won't be talking about it in this video. I might make a video later going into a little bit more depth about it, but I just wanted to mention this in case people were wondering. Alright, now I will be going over every single character in Smash 4 and tell you what I could find about the roll, starting with the Jumpman himself. Mario is a great example to start with, since his roll is actually very solid on all fronts. His roll length is not the longest, clocking at 10 squares, but what is really great about it is how little hurtbox shifting the roll has. As you can see, Mario can roll right next to the bumper and easily get by it. This might not seem like a big deal, but it's a luxury not every other character has. If you are unfamiliar with the frame data on rolls, the majority of rolls in Smash 4 get intangibility on frame 4, with varying amounts of intangibility frames and end lag. What can be a big problem is those 3 first frames of startup, because those 3 first frames are still a part of your roll, and some characters will then move a bit of distance before the intangibility has even started, which is obviously a bad thing. In the case of Mario, he stands in place for the 3 first frames, and only after he has gotten intangibility does he start to move. Combine this with some good above average frame data, and it turns into a very solid roll overall. Now, I planned on doing the characters in order of the title screen, and I will be doing so with this being one of 2 exceptions, because it's important to get this out of the way early, just to show how drastic early hurtbox shifting can really be. Lil Mac's roll is really bad. Sure, it has some upsides, it's the second longest roll in the game, with 12.5 squares to play around with. And while this can make it great for getting out of some difficult situations, the big problem lays with its frame data and its hurtbox shifting. Mac actually moves about 1/4 of the roll distance before actually getting any intangibility. Mac also really leans in when rolling, which makes his body cover way more area than it should. As you can see, this means that he simply cannot roll through the bumper at close ranges. And even when spacing it a bit, he still rolls right into it before getting intangibility. It certainly does not help that for some godforsaken reason, Mac's roll has 3 less frames of intangibility on average than every other roll in the game, which actually makes it impossible for him to even make it through the bumper at all, because of the way his hurt box shifts when intangibility ends. With Mac still having his leg out, it can easily get clipped by lingering active frames. And when you actually look at the distance Mac moves while having intangibility, you'll realize that it's actually very little distance at all. Like I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really matter how long your roll is if the intangibility is not spread out well. Little Mac's roll is a prime example of how much hurtbox shifting can truly matter. It's a roll with great potential held back by unfortunate hurtbox shifting and less than stellar frame data. It doesn't help that Mac only really has the ground to work with when it comes to movement, so having a consistent and solid roll is kind of important in that regard. Oh well, here's to hoping that they fix this in Smash Ultimate. Luigi's roll is almost identical to Mario's. It has a little more distance, but very similar hurtbox shifting. The only other difference between them is that Luigi's roll has 1 more frame of lag than Mario's, which is not really a big deal at all, so a very good roll. Peach's roll is interesting. Its length is on the shorter side, and it does have some minor hurtbox shifting on startup, which does make her bump into hitboxes close by, but it's not nearly as bad as the case with Little Mac. Peach moves kinda slowly and can have a really hard time rolling through the bumper, only really being able to do so at very specific ranges. Her back roll on the other hand is much more consistent, and does not really seem to have any early hurtbox shifting. It's a pretty decent roll overall. A big guy like Bowser could easily run into problems when it comes to rolling, but the roll itself is actually quite consistent. The length is nothing special, though the hurtbox shifts in just the right way to get around moves, even with a big body like Bowser. The only thing to note is that his frame data is a little slower than average, though in that same way he has a little bit more intangibility than others. It's a decent roll, not much more to say honestly. Yoshi's roll is actually even slower than Bowser's roll, with 2 more frames of lag, though this is compensated with 2 more frames of intangibility, though it does still lead to one of the slowest rolls in the game. And it's slow to the point where it actually really matters. The more lag a move has, the more time the opponent has to react to it. With this much intangibility, Yoshi can easily roll through the bumper. And seeing how Yoshi hides in his egg, it pretty much has no notable hurtbox shifting. It's a good roll held back by slow frame data. Rosalina's roll is pretty great. No major hurtbox shifting, good frame data, and a decent roll length. She sometimes gets hit when the intangibility ends, but this can be avoided with proper spacing. Not bad. Bowser Jr.'s roll is actually very good. He does have some minor early hurtbox shifting, but only when very close. Aside from that, the roll is pretty standard. It's got average frame data and decent length. He can consistently cover the area where the bumper is without much problems. It's a good roll. Wario's roll is sadly not very good. It suffers from the same problems as Little Mac's roll. Too much early hurtbox shifting, and not really moving fast enough while having intangibility, meaning he gets clipped on the bumper when intangibility ends. Overall, a less than stellar roll. DK's roll is okay. While it does not have any notable early hurtbox shifting, its roll animation really doesn't do any favors for him. His body barely moves at all. When intangibility ends, he still has a lot of his upper body in the spot where he just rolled through, meaning he can easily get hit by stuff that he actually just passed with most of his body. Surprisingly enough, its frame data is actually very fast for a guy of his size. But aside from that, this is not a very good roll. Diddy Kong has some minor early hurtbox shifting, though it's not really a huge deal. Aside from that, his forward roll can get through the bumper somewhat consistently. His back roll, however, is much more consistent in this case, which can get through it much easier, though both of them can easily get clipped, so you don't have a huge margin of error to work with. On the frame data side, he does pretty well, with a pretty early actable frame as well as good intangibility. Pretty solid overall. Game & Watch's roll is very strange. Because of the way his roll works, he does not have any early hurtbox shifting. The roll is built up of 4 different still animation frames. The problem arises when you look at how the intangibility covers those frames. He is fully intangible for the first 2 still frames, but halfway through the 3rd one it ends, meaning he gets stuck in that spot for a while without intangibility. And when you look at it, he really hasn't moved that far at that point, and this is very evident when rolling through the bumper. This is a great example of a seemingly irrelevant property actually having a huge impact on a roll. I'll just be referring to this as Game & Watch syndrome from now on. that being roles that suffer from not having one fluent animation, which often makes them waste intangibility frames on animations that move slowly. So just remember that going forward. Link's rolls are actually very good. His forward roll is pretty consistent and covers a nice amount of distance. But the real show is his back roll. It's very fast and most of the lag happens after Link has moved the distance. Along with no early hurtbox shifting and decent frame data, it's a very solid roll. Zelda's roll is pretty good on all fronts, with no notable hurtbox shifting and decent frame data. She does sometimes get clipped by the bumper, but for the most part she does well. Who would have known that Zelda was actually good at something in this game? Sheik suffers from some minor Game & Watch syndrome. Like I said earlier, what I mean by this is when characters have animations that slow them down or stall their intangibility in one place. It's not major, but it's pretty easy to see. Her back roll, on the other hand, is very similar to Link's back roll, with a backwards leap that is both fast and lifts them off the ground. So overall, very good. Ganon's rolls are honestly better than I thought. Both his forward and back roll covers the bumper distance easily. It does have some notable early hurtbox shifting, which can be problematic. And his frame data does leave something to be desired, but overall his roll is better than I expected. On the contrary, Toon Link's roll is a lot shorter than I expected, only having 10 units of length. Aside from that, he does suffer from some minor Game & Watch syndrome, with him landing on his back and having to use time to get up on his feet during the roll, and still having his head stick out in the area he just passed. He does actually have some of the best frame data on his rolls, in terms of how little lag it has at least, but overall his roll is not really that great. Samus' roll is a peculiar case. It is the longest roll in the game, both in terms of length and duration. Despite this, it's not a very good roll. It just has too much lag, and moves too slowly to really be good. When used properly, it can be good sometimes because of the sheer distance of the roll, but even this can easily be punished by fast characters. Samus' roll is just too much of a commitment to be a good panic or defensive option. It has some usage areas, but it's overall just not particularly great. Serious Suit's roll is pretty okay. Her forward roll would have been able to clear the bumper very well, had it not been for the fact that her leg sticks out downwards. But this is honestly not that big of a deal, since most hitboxes are taller. Her back roll has a serious case of Game & Watch syndrome. She jumps back and lands on her hands, and she stays there until her intangibility ends before jumping back onto the ground, which is not a good thing obviously. Her back roll is actually a little longer than her forward roll, which isn't that common. Her frame data is pretty good, and aside from her back roll, it's a decent roll overall. Pit's roll is almost very good. Both his forward and back roll can easily get through the bumper. Had it not been for some late hurtbox shifting on his forward roll where his leg sticks out like this, he could have made it past without spacing in mind. There's not much to say about it besides that though. Just a good roll. Fittingly enough, Palutena's rolls are very similar to Pet's, except without the leg hurtbox shifting. She can easily pass through the bumper and has no early hurtbox shifting to speak of. She does get hit sometimes depending on the distance between you and the bumper. Oddly enough, she probably has the biggest length difference between her forward and back roll, with her back roll being noticeably longer. Her frame data is pretty average. It's a good roll though, just not outstanding. Okay, so at this point I would talk about Marth, but it just so happens that all of the Fire Emblem characters have exceptionally good rolls. Yes, for some reason, every Fire Emblem character have outstanding rolls, with the exception of Robin, poor guy. Since they all act very similar, I decided to just talk about them all here together. They all look very similar animation-wise. The reason they're great is because of how fast they are. They're very straight to the point with all of the intangibility happening while they're moving, and only after they're about to stop does the intangibility end. Most of their roll lengths are also solidly in the average to above average range. Their frame data does vary a bit, but nothing to the point where it actually makes a noticeable difference. Marth, Lucina, Roy, and Ike all have outstanding rolls. They clear the bumper with an impressive margin to spare. Corrin's roll is a little less great than the rest, because they actually nerfed it in the 1.1.5 patch, but it used to be around the same as the rest of the characters. Robin is really the only outlier here. He has some notable early hurtbox shifting, and his roll is overall just slow and travels a very small distance. I do get why it's less good though. Robin is supposed to have some of the worst movement in the game, but yeah, the Fire Emblem gang has some good rolls. You know, besides Robin. Duck Duo actually has one of the best rolls in the game, frame data wise, in terms of how early you can act and how much intangibility it has. However, it does have some serious early hurtbox shifting, probably the second worst case behind Little Mac. Besides this, his roll is overall just slow, and its distance to intangibility ratio is pretty low. It's a pretty good example of how frame data is just not everything. Kirby's roll is pretty run-of-the-mill. It's fine, but nothing outstanding. It does have some minor Game & Watch syndrome, but nothing really that makes a huge difference. Meta Knight has good rolls. He has a very solid animation where he hides in his cape, which leads to no hurtbox shifting. It travels a good distance and has pretty good frame data. What more can you ask for? Dedede, oddly enough, has a really solid roll. It can easily cover the bumper distance, while its frame data is a little lacking in the first activable frame department. I would honestly take a roll that has a few extra frames of lag that can actually get me to the point where I want it to, rather than a roll that gets stuck on everything. So it's honestly pretty good. Fox has good frame data, but also suffers from Game & Watch syndrome, very similarly to the way Zero Suit does. His forward roll is a little better, but it's just too slow to cover the distance it needs in time. Falco's is a little better, but does have some very strange late hurtbox shifting. His body moves in a very non-optimal way. His back roll is also identical to Fox's, so it has the same problems as well. Pikachu does have one of the least laggy rolls in the game, but despite this, it has some problems. His forward roll has some serious early hurtbox shifting issues. His back roll is a little bit better in this sense, but not that much of a difference overall. Charizard's roll is a weird one. It looks like he would be able to cover the bumper without much of a problem, but it looks like his wings actually get clipped on the bumper in some way. The most absurd example being this, where he actually really should not have been hit at all, but still does. He can make it past with very specific spacing though. This is not a huge deal, however, since the bumper is a much bigger lingering hitbox than most you'll find on most characters. His back roll is actually much better though, and can easily clear the bumper, so it's a decent roll overall. Oddly enough, Lucario is actually tied with Lil Mac for the least amount of intangibility frames on a roll, though he is very much compensated for this, with his roll animation being among the fastest in the game. He has no early hurtbox shifting to speak of, with all the intangibility happening while he moves. While it's not as long as Lil Mac's roll, this is what I kinda wish Mac's roll was, though not having as much intangibility as the rest is a notable downside, which often can bite you despite the distance you move. If I had a 2.5 grade, I would give him that, but for the time being, I just put him in the second tier. Jigglypuff might be the worst character in Smash 4, but how does a roll fare? It's not really that great. It's just kind of lacking on all fronts. It's slow, has below average frame data, unimpressive length, just a very below average roll overall. And when comparing this to other rolls like Roy and Marth's roll, it just pales in comparison. Greninja has a very unique roll to the rest of the cast, but not really in a good way. For some reason, his back roll has 4 more frames of lag than his forward roll. I honestly have no idea why it is like this, and he is the only character in the entire game to be like this. As for the roll itself, it's actually very solid. Especially his back roll is very good, and covers a nice distance. It's a great roll overall, even if it has a weird quirk to it. Rob has a minor early hurtbox shifting on both his back and forward roll. Aside from that, his roll is okay. Nothing special, but not awful either. Ness's roll is pretty standard. His forward roll cannot pass through the bumper, but his back roll travels faster so it actually can. There's no notable hurtbox shifting to speak of, so it's a fine roll overall. Falcon has some issues with his forward roll. The animation makes Falcon jump on his back, which wastes a few frames of intangibility. His back roll is better though. It has the same animation as Fox, except that Falcon can actually clear the bumper. Villager is actually tied with Ryu for the shortest roll in the game, only having 9.5 units to work with. Though distance is not everything, how does his roll fare against the almighty bumper? Not very well is the answer. He has some notable early hurtbox shifting, which makes rolling through the bumper with his forward roll out of the question. His back roll is a little better, but not by much. It's overall not a very good roll. Olimar is pretty much the same story. Some minor early hurtbox shifting and just underwhelming performance against the bumper. Beefy Trainer has a decent roll. It's able to cross the bumper on rare occasions. Her back roll is the same story, except with some minor early hurtbox shifting. It's got good frame data and is a decent roll overall. Shulk's roll is surprisingly great. He can easily clear the bumper without much of a problem. His forward roll is a little better than his back roll, but not by that much. I honestly don't have that much to say about it, besides the fact that it's just consistent. When changing proficient, it looks like most of Mario's rolling abilities carried over. They even have the same frame data and everything, which makes it a very solid roll. Naturally enough, Dark Pit has a very similar roll to Pit, with Dark Pit's roll having the same weaknesses and strength as Pit's roll. so just skip back to pit if you want a more detailed explanation. Pac-Man has a decent enough roll. He does have some good overall hurtbox shifting, with him crouching into a ball reducing his hurtbox. Despite this, his roll gets clipped by the bumper on occasion, though he can make it past with spacing. His back roll has some minor early hurtbox shifting, but it's not a huge deal. It's a decent roll. Mega Man's roll is actually very good. It's very fast and straight to the point. Both his forward roll and back roll can easily clear the bumper. It has almost no hurtbox shifting on startup, and it's overall just a very solid roll. Sonic might be the fastest thing alive, but does that make him good at rolling? Well, yes, apparently. His roll is insanely fast during startup, with Sonic covering a relatively huge amount of distance in just a few frames. Despite this, he actually does not have any notable early hurtbox shifting, which just leaves him with a very solid roll, because Sonic really just needed more good movement options. Mewtwo's roll is pretty standard, but does have some issues. Its length is good, but it does suffer in the frame data department, having notably less intangibility than a lot of the other rolls in the game. Him having a very large hurtbox overall does not really help this either. I guess this is to compensate for his very much above average air dodge. The second Mother Boy is actually much like the first one. He can roll through the bumper with both rolls, but they need very specific spacing. And all of that is because of his huge head getting in the way. His frame data is nothing special and neither is his roll distance, but it's a good roll overall. Ryu, as I alluded to earlier, is tied with Villager for the shortest roll distance in the game. Despite this, his roll is not awful. His forward roll does have some Game & Watch syndrome in there, and his back roll has some late hurtbox shifting where he still has a lot of his leg out. But overall, the roll is not awful. Nimbus Man actually has a pretty solid forward roll, which is kind of surprising seeing how it was actually nerfed alongside Corrin's roll. It's fast and can cross the bumper pretty easily, though he also has a case of the, shall we say, stanky leg. Though it's not as noticeable as with Ryu, and the same is true for his back roll. While good, there's nothing really outstanding about it. And finally there is Bayonetta, which is quite a peculiar case, because of a little thing called Bat Within, which actually means I can't use the bumper for this one, since it actually does not trigger Bat Within. So I just went with a Rapid Jab, since that is kind of what the bumper is supposed to emulate anyways. Now, she does technically have the fastest roll in the game, with Bat Within triggering on frame 3, but that's about where the good ends for her roll, since the rest of her frame data is quite lacking, with a very slow first actable frame and only decent intangibility go along with it. Though she can easily pass through the Rapid Jab with Bat Within, and sometimes she does not even need that. Her roll is not great, but it's good enough to be annoying. And with that, we have covered every roll in the game. And the burning question on everyone's mind is, whose roll is the best? Well, obviously it's one from the 3 category. But honestly, after that, it really starts to get blurry, since the margin of difference becomes a lot smaller. And honestly, it all comes down to the situation at hand. Sometimes just having one more frame of intangibility can make or break a successful roll escape. And other times, just half a unit of distance can be the deciding factor. Because the truth is that there is no definite best roll in Smash. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. Obviously there are some that are better than others, but my point here today was really just to underline how different something as seemingly simple as a roll really can be. And if anything, I at least got to talk about how overrated Lil Mac's roll is, which I have actually wanted to do for a long time. But I hope you learned something as well, and maybe next time you see someone spamming roll, you'll be just a little bit more equipped to handle it. Especially with the roll nerfs in Ultimate. But that is for a different time entirely. And until that time, I thank you so much for watching.